Thank you, Anna. I'll jump in first just with acknowledgement of the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet today. I'm in Flemington, which is on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I did just want to say that my video is not doing too well today. I haven't had a successful video conference from 8:30, so I'm not trying to hide behind my funny name there on the Zoom call. You might think I'm trying to hide because I just noticed that Bob pretty much said it's up to me to fix it in Victoria. I think that's what I got when you said whose problem is it, and you said education departments was on the top of the list. I actually tend to agree with you in partnership with researchers and others. And it's kind of interesting. Up until that slide, Bob, I was thinking to myself, my God, people in this audience are going to probably hear the same things from me and Bob. In the sense that a lot of the things you've touched on there are certainly things we're thinking about in the Department of Education and Training, until you dumped me in it on the last slide, and then I realised we weren't quite there. So I do work as a Director of Curriculum and Assessment in the department. I'm an educator by background, and I have lots of interesting things in my portfolio, including at this stage thinking about out of field teaching, and I've been privileged enough to partner with Linda and others at Deakin University to really deep dive into this over the last little while. So I too was given the brief around what evidence is needed to inform what policies and what government responses are occurring and what else is needed. I'm going to answer both of these questions or put something out there, but I'm going to actually answer them in reverse order, because I'm very interested in what the current government responses reveal about what evidence is needed to inform which policies, because even the language around out of field teaching and how we use it and how we think about it, I think is really quite fascinating. So essentially, you know, our big initiative, and this sits in my portfolio, our big initiative at the moment in the out of field space is called the SMSI. It's the Secondary Maths and Science Initiative. It's worth about $18 million and it's currently running. We are training up 272 currently out of field teaching teachers across Victoria, and we actually have a bias to rural and regional based on the data and evidence that's out there. So 50% of the places are reserved for rural and regional teachers. Deakin is partnering with us to deliver graduate certificates, and that interests me, of course, the extent to which out of field can be addressed through formal qualifications. They're expensive. The qualifications in our program aren't the major expense. The major expense is in the time release we provide to teachers to engage in these courses. And just to give you a sense, and this is going to sound a bit techie, but we basically provide schools with resources to the equivalent of 0.2 of a 2.6 teacher salary, which is the equivalent of 1 day a week in a teaching load for participants in this program to complete the course requirements, which of course involve, you know, in the assessments, the actual application in classroom contexts. I will point out, and this is something I'm also very interested in, that we probably thought we'd be oversubscribed in this program. We thought schools and teachers would jump at it. It's a bit hard to work out whether COVID is the reason they haven't. And I think it's fair enough to say that teachers, when we were recruiting last year, weren't exactly thinking that they wanted to take on an additional qualification. But one of the things we have noticed is that we've struggled a bit to get to our 272. And it's interesting, one of my observations about this and reflections is the extent to which we see this as a problem that teachers solve as individuals, so you build individual capacity, versus the idea that schools and principals as workforce managers need to be on this and sort of tapping teachers. And I'm quite interested in an offer like this. A lot of school principals have seen this as more something that's to the benefit of the teacher rather than the benefit of the PRIN. And that's been one of the things that we've had to work through in our messaging in thinking about how to drive uptake. And I think there's policy implications around that and the advice, for example, that a department might provide to principals around workforce planning, et cetera, et cetera. So interesting. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of our other programs. And one of the things I want to foreground for your consideration is that none of the rest of them are actually tagged as out of field. So this is the only program that where we've gone out on the front foot and said out of field is the thing we're trying to deal with here. And it interests me that the other programs that are really tackling the same kind of underlying issue, which is the extent to which teachers have the content knowledge, the pedagogical content knowledge, and the assessment capability to deliver those really high quality programs, that language is not used around other programs that we run. And I wonder whether that is also something that we need to really think more about in partnership with universities and other thinkers in this space around how that might be slightly getting in the way of tackling this kind of issue. So probably our flagship program actually is in primary education, because we're worried in that STEM pipeline kind of space that kids are turning off really early. And we don't want to solve the issue at the VCE if, you know, there's a bigger issue with out of field in secondary education, but also in primary education if, you know, kids are not even getting the foundations that they need. And we've essentially run 600 specialists through this program since 2010. It's a massive commitment from government, and it's a commitment of successive governments of different political stripes. I do look after STEM education, so my presentation to you today is quite STEMmy. It's not the only thing I look after. I look after arts too, and I'm going to talk about that in a little while, but that does influence the sort of things I'm putting in front of you. Just the current cohort of 200 specialists, when we're in the middle of that, costs about $32.8 million. It's a big investment, and it involves 20 days over 2 years of professional learning. And it also involves release of teachers 0.5 FTE for 2 years to plan and enact change. It's a big, big thing. And it's funny, often when we get visiting delegations, obviously no time, not recently, but we get visiting delegations come out and ask us about our programs. When they hear the cost and the fact that it's a 2-year thing and it involves classroom teachers being basically released from half of their teaching load, you sort of see it, sometimes you see the whites of their eyes thinking, oh my God, that's very expensive. But it's also quite a transformative program. We've done longitudinal studies on these 600 that have been through, and we have an overrepresentation of, and you can just see there, award winners nationally and at state level, and some evidence that they actually are successful in moving into leadership positions in schools. The other program I run, my team runs, is Music in Schools. And, you know, this is a smaller program, but it also targets primary school teachers, and it targets teachers that literally have schools that have no program or a very limited program, and generalist teachers. Because there's a shortage of qualified music teachers, and this is concentrated in rural and regional areas, which you can see on my slide. This program's been around since 2015, and we've had almost 2,000 teachers through this program since we've gone, and it's just recently attracted ongoing funding by the state government. You'll see in a minute why I've picked these three, probably in a couple of minutes. Not just that they're in my program, but there's a reason that they're in the areas they are. And I'm interested when Bob was talking about the fact that the discipline matters. It matters whether you're talking about, you know, you can't just talk about teaching. You've got to talk about teaching in the discipline of mathematics or science or the sub-discipline of biology when you're talking about these kind of things. We also do heaps of other stuff, and it was interesting again that Bob mentioned these toolkits, and the department loves toolkits. One of the ones that my team developed was a mathematics teaching toolkit, and we have got this massive suite of resources. We've got monographs of research, we've got challenges that teachers can use, we've even got a cartoon series of 5 puppy dogs. It's kind of crazy, like the amount of resources that are out there. But it's kind of also interesting. You know, I worry a little bit that sometimes governments see the solution to be another toolkit, but the toolkit itself is not enough. So it raises that question around what are the things that are enough? And of course, all of these things are opt-in for educators and for schools, which raises a set of questions. And these are just some examples of the beautiful things that we have created. And we have lots of software, and I'm also interested in that space. Digital's been in my portfolio for a long time in the department. It's just moved out of my portfolio. But there's also a view in departments that software has a role, that technology has a role in kind of supporting teachers and learners. So for example, ClickView, thousands and thousands of content videos. So, you know, that can help. You know, Education Perfect, in this particular example, we license on behalf of Schools for Science. That can help out of field teachers or teaching. But the extent to which the provision of these things solves the problem is a question that, you know, really needs to be scrutinised. And we have lots of smaller programs, including a recent one that I was very excited about around dance and drama, where we're out with small primary schools in rural and regional areas and building the capacity by putting teaching artists out there to work with schools, not just to start a program in dance and drama. They're areas of the curriculum that are often not taught at all by schools, driven a bit by staff shortages, but also to support those teachers to move forward and start to deliver programs themselves. So the interesting thing for me, and I've already mentioned this, is only one of these is actually considered to be an out of field program, but in a sense they all play in that space, which raises the question for me, you know, is that okay? And is the fact that there's a lack of kind of connectedness of understanding how all the bits play together, is that kind of a thing that systems would benefit, or systems like the one I represent would benefit working more closely with researchers and others to think through. So Bob also mentioned this, the Alice Springs Declaration and the various acts and regulation, and in some ways this stuff does make it really clear that content matters, and so does the pedagogical choices being linked to that content as well as the assessment capability. My part of the department is responsible for the various DEP policies, including curriculum programs, but at this stage the department is silent on out of field teaching. So there's no policy in place, no targets, etc. in this space. I'm not suggesting that's not going to change sometime soon, but I think we're now coming to terms with where the absence of policy is meaning the problem is probably masked. And that's also related to the fact that data has not been particularly forthcoming. That's the broader policy context. And of course, you've got the overlay of a specific government. And one of the reasons I raise this is that these are the particular targets of our current government in Victoria. And you can see there perhaps why we've got the programs we've got. And that's because those things have been identified by the government as things that they want to see a shift in. And it is interesting because the fact that they want to shift this is informed by research and evidence and data collection. They've also, the current government has set public targets around these, which puts the pressure on, and it means that we do have an ability to do this. One of the challenges around this is possibly that where there aren't data sets that have influenced a creation of this sort of list, that we might in fact be missing opportunities that we're not aware of. It's sort of the unknown unknowns. Big shout out to the Deakin team involved in this. Linda Coral, Seamus, Chris and Jerry, who did start to work with us in 2019 to really get to the bottom of this. And we started this piece of research was commissioned from my area of the department. We started this because I was asked the question, how long would it take to solve the out of field problem? And you guys would know that is not the easiest question to answer because there's a whole lot of assumptions in there. And my initial answer was, well, it actually depends. It depends on a whole range of things. And we couldn't really even do a backyard, the back of the envelope calculation, because it all depends on how it's understood and defined, depends on the data that's available. It depends on your construct of the problem and how you might solve it and what you might do to solve it if you don't have ideal conditions. And it's another thing I think that was very interesting, and I was sort of happy to hear it in a way, Bob, thinking, oh my God, like I worry about this. It is not practical right now to say we have the ability in a very short period of time to completely eliminate out of field teaching in a place like Victoria. So therefore, what are your best options becomes the next question. So we realized that we were nowhere near being able to answer this problem, which is why we ended up getting back to the first piece of research, and this won't be the only one we do. And we started with defining and mapping, because we realized straight away that the data sets that are available, we have to make inferences for, because there wasn't enough state level data. But we also realized when we started to look at these data sets that all of them defined it a little bit differently. And as a result, you weren't necessarily comparing apples to apples. So we have absolutely loved getting this report, and I can't really talk about it at the moment, but it's not a report that's sitting on the shelf, let's put it that way. It raises a whole set of questions, and I know a version of this report has been made available in some context during this conference, Linda, for others to have a look at, because it does offer a really interesting set of constructs. It's like a pretty amazing piece of work. So for me, it's kind of raised a whole set of questions. We've answered some questions and we haven't answered others. And this is kind of my list of the sorts of things that I'm thinking about at the moment. One is that it's very easy for governments to kind of probably start to think, you know, it's the big rocks. Oh, okay, let's deal with technologies. But as soon as you start to talk about dealing with technologies, you've got to say, hang on, there's a difference between design technology and digital technologies. And then as soon as you do that, you realize there's a great diversity within design and technology. And as soon as you do that, so there's kind of a question around how deep do you go before, as a government, you can't really get responses that are going to, you know, attract funding and that you're going to be able to push out. I've also become very interested in principals and their role in this. I think we do talk in the out of field space a lot about teachers, and we should, but principals as decision makers and workforce managers, absolutely fascinating. I don't know that they've got the eyes sometimes to see the nature of the problem. And I think the department has a role to help them do that by other things that are on the list here, like targets and thresholds and prioritization and advice and guidance. Clearly, Bob's already picked this up. Equity is a real concern, rural and regional and low SES, and we want to know a bit more about that. I'm also not just interested in primary settings. You mentioned that, Bob, but specialist settings. Very interested in this. I don't see it around a lot. And what I will say is that the department, Linda might be happy with this and the team, we have started to do some internal data collection as a result of thinking about the impact of the report saying that we don't have Victoria-wide data. And one of the things that's already been a surprise to us is how much specialist settings are coming up. But the nature of our understanding of what it means to be in and out of field in a specialist setting is really quite different. One of the things I've been personally very influenced by and sort of, you know, horrified by in a way is the way that this, I wouldn't have necessarily known just how much this is impacting out of our early career teachers and some of the cultural factors in schools that are impacting on that. I'm very interested in that. We keep talking about generally in education, the challenge that comes from burnout. You know, teachers don't stay.
Penny, just a warning, 2 minutes.
No problem. This is my last slide, so it's good. You know, we worry about teacher burnout and why teachers are leaving the system. And I've started to now really think that this could be a really important factor that may not have been you know, fully understood. We're very interested in models that work, and that's probably where we're going to look at next. And it's about those thresholds when you simply cannot recruit a teacher. And there are plenty of small schools around in rural and regional parts of Victoria that have tried and tried and tried again. So what do we do to support those? Mentoring, professional learning, collaborative local arrangements, etc. Prioritization I've talked to you about. We've already got priorities through our Ed State targets, but because you can't do everything at once. Thresholds, where might we draw the line where we say we would tolerate some out of field teaching? What might be on either side of the line? If you were to set targets, how do you actually set realistic but aspirational targets? We're obviously very interested in other states and territories. Bob, you picked this one up again, autonomy versus centralisation in terms of responses. I was very interested in the Deakin research that there's evidence to say that really autonomous systems with the right leaders can solve this issue. Centralised systems can also solve this issue. Sometimes it doesn't work though. And I still get amazed in my organisation, and I'll finish with this, that even though these questions that I've got here around digging deeper are a bit more specialised, that I still get amazed that I have conversations with colleagues that don't seem to pick up that content matters. So these arguments about generic pedagogies being suitable all of the time. I just don't get it. And sometimes I think maybe rather than going into the detail around all these extra things, we possibly, in partnership with researchers and other organisations, need to up the ante on the really simple stuff in terms of communicating it. And that is that choices around assessment and around pedagogy have to be influenced by the content or the discipline or the domain that you're working in. And I don't think we've won that. You would think we have because it's in the AITSL standards, but I have found at times that that seems to not be completely embraced by policymakers.